to a string, which is why you can print those things from simple XML, but I'm explicitly changing it to strings because I want a string. But this is just a more nitpicky detail that I decided to embrace. But again, this code's all online if you want to borrow parts of it as needed. And then I did this. And you might have done something differently, but you can infer from my code what I did here and why. What's the motivation for this one-liner? It's obviously remembering department, but how? What am I really building up more technically here? Yeah?
You're basically just building up like a cache of departments, so you don't have to do a bunch of insert statements every time.
Perfect. Yeah, so I want to essentially, looks where I'm going with this is I'm going to iterate over all the courses, and as I do that, I'm going to build up a cache of all of the departments I see, but I'm not just going to add the department to an array per se. What am I instead doing here? Yeah, I'm caching it based on the code. So I have an associative array or a hash table here called departments. And then notice the square brackets. I'm indexing into it using a string value, which is totally legit in PHP. And as an aside, if I didn't have this here, this line of code would fail because I'd be trying to use an object as a key. So I needed to explicitly make it a string. So I'm putting in the department code, which is something like comp sci. And then what am I putting as its value? So it's short name, computer science. So what does this help me avoid? If I had just used a simple array and appended to an array again and again, what would I get? I'd get a huge departments array with like 100 copies of computer science if there's 100 computer science courses. So this way I'm ensuring uniqueness. So on the first iteration, this is useful because I'm getting comp sci equals computer science. On subsequent iterations, I'm blowing away that same value. So if I really wanted to be anal, I could first say, is it set? If so, continue, else do this, but this is a nice one-liner for just building up a nice key value store that I can later iterate over. All right, so it would have been nicer if FAS just gave us a separate departments XML file, but we have to infer it from courses. I'm going to do the exact same trick for course group, and then I'm going to do the following. So if you're not using prepared, this was one of the opportunities for PDO, which we talked briefly a bit about last week. Notice that at the very top of the code, I created my connection to the database. Let me quickly go back to that. That was right here. So recall that I created this database handle, DBH, using the username and password. So notice now what I'm doing. I want to insert the current course into one of my tables. And I'm not inserting all the fields that you care about for the project. I'm just doing some basic ones. So notice I get this statement ready. It's wrapping because of the font size. But insert into course these several fields, these several values. What do the colons denote before each value? Yeah, it's like placeholder. It's like a fancy version of %s. Put something here. What do I want to put there? Well, notice I'm preparing an associative array. And I could have done this in one line, but I wanted to just make it more readable as code. So I'm creating an associative array of cat num to this, course group to this, and those fields I got earlier, recall, from the XML. Why am I doing this? These two one-liners with the ternary operator? What design decision did I apparently make in my database? And recall that numInt and numchar, they're actually optional, right? There's math A, which doesn't have a number, but there's computer science 50, which doesn't have a char.
Since you're only going to have one or the other, you have the option of taking null.
Right. So I made the conscious choice, and we'll see this if we go over to phpMyAdmin, that because not all courses have a numInt or have a numchar, rather than just concatenate them, I'm going to still keep them separate just because that's what I wanted to do. But what's nice about PDO2 is that I can explicitly pass in null if I want that field in my database to actually be null as opposed to the empty string. Now why? Functionally might not have a huge difference, but just in terms of design, if you have no value for the char or the int, you really should be putting in null. So that's the role of this. So if this is empty, the numInt variable is empty, let's actually insert null for numInt. Otherwise, let's insert the actual int. Same deal for description. And I only realized description accidentally. I was skimming through my database tables, and I realized, wow, some of these courses don't have descriptions. Let me go back, make it a null value optionally. Now I'm executing the statement using PDO. And again, there's no new SQL here. This is all like CS50 style SQL, just with a different library on top of it. But this is what's interesting. Why am I conditionally calling this rollback method? Think back to last week's discussion of databases. Yeah?
In case the it fails, you want to just go back to the previous state of the data.
Yeah, exactly. In case something fails, I want to roll back to the point at which I began my transaction. And this is mostly self-defense. Like, I don't doubt that at some point I'm going to screw this script up, or FAS is going to tweak the data in such a way that the query is going to fail because there's some field missing now. And so what I want to make sure that when I'm at midnight running this update script, or I'm using a cron job to do this automatically, if anything goes wrong that was unanticipated, especially while I'm sleeping, I don't want to leave the database in an inconsistent state. I want this whole import to happen or not at all. So the motivations for transactions here are huge, because what this means is that even at the very last course number 4000 whatever, if there's some kind of syntax error in my code or some kind of logical error in the XML file and that insert fails, no problem, the whole thing fails. Now, of course, the application has stale data, but at least it has data, and it has correct data, albeit from 24 hours ago. So the worst thing you could do is get your database into some funky state where you maybe have duplicate courses or some courses and things dropping off. So transactions are a huge help with this. They're not just about avoiding race conditions. They're about enforcing atomicity. So it all happens or not at all. So I roll back there, and now recall that I have faculty here, so let me wave my hands at some of this as being useful if you want to read up on it at home and improve your own code. But I'm doing something similar now for instructors, iterating over each of the course's faculty. But then notice later on, only at the very bottom, let's see. Yeah, I didn't bother. Actually, you know what? I started doing it. I have the array of departments, but I actually decided, because it was no longer enlightening for lecture, there is no departments table. So I don't actually use that data. But what I do have is this join table. So we talked a bit about this last week. Recall that if you have two pieces of data, like courses, and courses have instructors, but that's a many-to-many relationship, where a course can have many instructors, and an instructor can teach many courses. You kind of have to somehow be able to rejoin instructors with courses. And so a very common paradigm in SQL, in relational databases, is you have a third table, a join table, that's named similar to both tables, where you take one word from one table, underscore one word from another, or something like that. And what does this have, apparently? This table has catnum, comma, instructor ID. So what I'm doing here is in my third table, I'm making sure that I can reconstruct the association of faculty with courses by having this third table. And we'll actually talk to that table in code in just a moment. Yeah?
Would doing an insert ignore for departments being a lot more costly than the method you would have done?
No, insert ignore is actually good. And I'm actually doing it. Yeah, well, let's see. Why did I do it here? Actually, this is copy, paste, fail. This one was necessary. Why did I do insert ignore into instructors? This was deliberate. Right? Like, so Malan teaches two courses, and if I have on my instructors table a primary key on instructor ID, the second time I try to insert Malan for, say, the second course, CS164, I would actually get a SQL error, which means I would trigger that if condition, which means I would roll back just because I happen to teach two courses. And same deal for any other instructor. So I do an ignore here, because this is telling SQL it is not an error to fail to insert this row if it's already there because of a key collision. So I don't need it elsewhere, because unless the data is wrong, I don't need it for the join table.
So that same approach could work for departments?
Absolutely. It would be a perfect approach for departments as well, but it assumes that you've defined a unique key, namely a primary key on instructors. So here's the quick tour. In my courses table, which is probably simpler than yours, I have this structure here, catnum, course group, numint, numchar, and I counted up sort of late at night how many numbers are actually in a catnum and how many are in some of these other ones, just to get an upper bound. I could be off by one, so don't take my numbers as holy grail. But here's my fields. Notice how many of them I said can be null over on the right. And then if I scroll down to indexes, which of these fields should probably have a key on it? Some kind of index, rather? So catnum should probably have a primary key. And you know what? If I'm often searching on something else, what's another good candidate for an index? What's that? So title. Yeah, if I want to do like-based searches on title. Maybe course group if I want to get all comp sci courses, for instance, and so forth. So a number of design decisions there. And then lastly, instructors is pretty similarly structured. ID first and last. And then course instructors is the interesting one, and this one we'll actually use in code now in just a moment. And this is how we tie the two together. So consider this representative, if imperfect and incomplete, of the kinds of decisions that you might still want to make if you're finding that your own decisions weren't quite panning out as optimal. All right, so, oh, and lastly, lest you use a script like this and then wonder why it doesn't work, there's one line of code that's super important, this. Okay, that's like the save before quitting feature. So that commits the entire transaction and all of the queries that you'd executed up until then. All right, so let's do this. Any questions? OK, one announcement then from Tommy. Let me, my mic's over here, so.
This is going to be awkward.
That's fine.
Okay, so just a reminder that check-ins are starting this week. If you find yourself having trouble with CodeIgniter, what is MVC, how do these various components interact, and you haven't really made as much headway as you would have liked on your first project, definitely encourage you to come along to the